What if the way a dismissive avoidant defines a healthy relationship is completely different from what you expect? Not slightly different, fundamentally different. And that gap in definition is often the hidden reason why things feel confusing, unbalanced, or emotionally unsatisfying, even when nothing seems obviously wrong on the surface. Most people grow up with an idea that a healthy relationship involves closeness, emotional openness, consistent communication, and a sense of mutual dependence. Not in a suffocating way, but in a way where both people feel safe leaning on each other. There's an expectation that connection deepens over time, that vulnerability increases, and that emotional needs are expressed and met through shared effort. But for a dismissive avoidant, that same picture can feel overwhelming. To them, a healthy relationship isn't defined by how emotionally close you are. It's defined by how stable and low pressure the connection feels. And stability in their mind comes from maintaining a strong sense of independence. Independence isn't just something they value, it's something they rely on. At a core level, dismissive avoidants are wired to feel safest when they don't have to depend too much on anyone else. That self-reliance becomes a kind of emotional anchor. It gives them a sense of control, predictability, and protection from situations where they might feel vulnerable or exposed. So when they think about a relationship being healthy, they're not asking, "How connected do we feel?" They're asking, "Do I still feel like myself? Do I still have space? Do I still feel in control of my time and emotions?" If the answer is yes, the relationship feels manageable. If the answer starts to shift toward dependency, emotional intensity, or increased expectations, something inside them starts to tighten. Because for them, needing someone or being needed too much can feel like a loss of control. And that's where one of the biggest misunderstandings begins. You might interpret closeness as a sign that things are progressing in a healthy direction. More communication, more emotional sharing, more time together, it all feels like growth. But to a dismissive avoidant, those same changes can feel like pressure building. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because their internal definition of balance is different. Where you see connection, they may feel intensity. Where you feel comfort, they may feel expectation. Where you feel closeness, they may feel a subtle loss of independence. So to maintain what they consider healthy, they naturally regulate the level of closeness. They might keep conversations lighter rather than going too deep emotionally. They may limit how much they share about their inner world. They might pull back slightly when things start to feel too close. From the outside, this can look like disinterest or emotional unavailability. But from their perspective, it feels like maintaining balance. Because too much emotional depth, too quickly or too consistently, can feel destabilizing. Deep conversations, especially ones that involve vulnerability, emotional needs, or relationship definitions, don't always register as bonding experiences for them. Instead, they can feel like moments where expectations are being introduced. Expectations to respond in a certain way, expectations to meet emotional needs, expectations to stay consistently engaged at a deeper level. And when expectations increase, so does the internal pressure. That's why they often prefer to keep things in a space that feels manageable. Not shallow but not too deep either, comfortable but not consuming. Connected but not dependent, this balance allows them to stay present without feeling overwhelmed. Another key part of their definition of a healthy relationship is control. Not control in the sense of controlling another person, but control over themselves. Over how much they give, over how much they share, over how emotionally involved they allow themselves to become. That control acts as a protective mechanism. Because once emotional involvement reaches a certain level, it introduces uncertainty. What if they get hurt? What if they can't meet expectations? What if they lose their sense of independence? Rather than navigating those uncertainties directly, their instinct is to prevent them from becoming too strong in the first place. So they manage the level of closeness, they stay engaged but within limits. And those limits can be difficult to understand if you're approaching the relationship from a different emotional framework. Because from your side, it may feel like something is missing. Like there's a barrier that never fully comes down. Like no matter how much time passes, the connection doesn't deepen in the way you expect it to. But from their side, they may feel like everything is fine, stable, drama-free, comfortable, and that's another important piece of this dynamic. Dismissive avoidants often associate emotional intensity with instability. Arguments, emotional highs and lows, deep vulnerability, these things can feel chaotic to them. So if a relationship doesn't have those elements, they interpret it as healthy, even if, from another perspective, it lacks emotional depth. This is why two people can be in the same relationship and experience it completely differently. You might feel like something important is missing. They might feel like everything is going smoothly. Neither perspective is necessarily wrong, it's just based on a different internal definition of what a relationship should feel like. And because they genuinely believe their approach is healthy, they don't always see a reason to change it. They may think they're being easygoing, low maintenance, not creating unnecessary drama. From their point of view, they're contributing to a stable connection. But what's often missing is the recognition that stability without emotional depth can feel distant to someone who values closeness. And that gap is where frustration begins to build. Because you may try to introduce more connection, more conversation, more emotional openness, hoping it will bring the relationship to a place that feels more fulfilling. But for them, those attempts can feel like a shift away from what they consider balanced. And instead of leaning in, they may subtly pull back, not dramatically. Not always in obvious ways, but enough to maintain the level of distance that feels comfortable to them. Over time, this creates a kind of emotional mismatch. You move closer. They adjust by creating space. You try to deepen the connection. They try to keep it steady. And without understanding the underlying difference in how each of you defines healthy, it can feel like you're constantly out of sync. The important thing to recognize is that a dismissive avoidant isn't trying to create distance for the sake of it. They're trying to maintain a version of connection that feels safe. A version where they can stay present without feeling overwhelmed. A version where they don't lose themselves in the process. But that version may not align with what you need to feel secure and fulfilled. And that's where awareness becomes important. Because once you understand that their idea of a healthy relationship is rooted in independence, low emotional pressure and controlled closeness, their behavior starts to make more sense. Not necessarily to justify it, but to see it clearly. And when you see it clearly, you can start to decide whether that version of healthy works for you. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about understanding their perspective. It's about recognizing whether that perspective aligns with your own needs. And that realization changes how you approach everything that comes next. When this idea of healthy moves from theory into an actual relationship, it doesn't show up as something obvious or clearly defined. It shows up in patterns, small, consistent behaviors that shape how the connection feels over time. And at first, those patterns can seem normal, even ideal in some ways, because they don't come with chaos or intensity. Everything can feel steady, calm, and easy on the surface. A dismissive avoidant can be present in a relationship. They can spend time with you, communicate regularly, and maintain a level of consistency that gives the impression that things are stable. There may not be dramatic ups and downs, there may not be constant conflict. And because of that, it can feel like the relationship is functioning well. But as time passes, something subtle starts to stand out. The connection doesn't seem to deepen. It stays in a certain range, comfortable but not fully intimate. You might share experiences, talk about daily life, even laugh and enjoy each other's company. But when it comes to emotional depth, there's often a limit. Conversations rarely go too far into vulnerability. Feelings aren't explored in a detailed or consistent way. There's a sense that something is being held back, even if you can't immediately define what it is. This isn't because they don't have emotions, it's because they don't naturally express them in the way you might expect. Dismissive avoidants often process their feelings internally rather than externally. They may feel something strongly, but instead of talking about it, they think through it on their own. They analyze it, minimize it, or simply let it pass without giving it much attention. So from your perspective, it can seem like they're not feeling much at all, when in reality, they're just not sharing it. This creates a gap. You might be open, expressive, and willing to talk through emotions as they come up. You might expect that kind of exchange to be mutual. But instead, you find yourself being the one who brings things up. The one who tries to deepen the conversation. The one who initiates emotional connection. And over time, that can start to feel one-sided. Because emotional intimacy isn't just about feeling something, it's about sharing it. And when one person shares more than the other, it creates an imbalance. Another way this dynamic shows up is in their need for space. This isn't occasional or situational, it's a consistent part of how they maintain their sense of balance. They need time alone, time without interaction, time where they're not engaged in the relationship in an active way. And while everyone needs space to some degree, for a dismissive avoidant it's more central. It's how they reset, it's how they stay regulated. If they spend too much time in close interaction, especially emotional interaction, it can start to feel draining rather than connecting. So they pull back not necessarily because something is wrong, but because they need to return to a level of independence that feels comfortable. The challenge is that this need for space doesn't always align with your need for connection. You might interpret their distance as disinterest. You might feel like they're pulling away, you might wonder if something changed. But for them, it can feel completely normal. Just a way of maintaining what they see as a healthy balance between togetherness and independence. This becomes even more noticeable when the relationship starts to deepen. Because as emotional closeness increases, so does their instinct to create distance. Not in a dramatic or intentional way, but in small adjustments. They might respond a little less, take longer to engage, seem slightly less available than before. And these changes can be confusing because they often happen right after moments of connection. You might have a meaningful conversation, share something personal, or feel like you've gotten closer, and then shortly after they seem to pull back. This push-pull dynamic isn't random, it's a response to internal discomfort. Closeness activates vulnerability. Vulnerability feels uncertain. So distance is used to restore a sense of control. From your perspective, it can feel like mixed signals. From theirs, it feels like self-regulation. Another area where this difference becomes clear is in how they handle conflict. When something comes up, whether it's a misunderstanding, a disagreement, or an unmet need, the natural response for many people is to address it. To talk it through, understand each other, and find some kind of resolution. But for a dismissive avoidant, conflict often feels like something to avoid rather than engage with. Not because they don't care about resolving issues, but because the emotional intensity of conflict can feel overwhelming. So instead of leaning into it, they may withdraw, they might go quiet, change the subject, or minimize the issue altogether. From their perspective, this helps keep the relationship stable. It avoids escalation, it prevents things from becoming too emotional. But from your perspective, it can feel like your concerns aren't being heard. Like there's no real resolution, like important things are being left unaddressed. And over time, that can lead to frustration, because problems don't necessarily disappear just because they're not discussed. They linger, they build, and without open communication, they don't get fully resolved. Another pattern that often shows up is their tendency not to express needs. Dismissive avoidants are used to relying on themselves. They've developed a sense of independence where asking for help or expressing needs doesn't come naturally. So even in a relationship, they may not clearly communicate what they want or need. They might assume they'll handle things on their own. Or they might not even fully recognize their own needs in the moment. This can make the relationship feel unclear, because instead of direct communication, there's guesswork. You may find yourself trying to figure out what they want, trying to adjust without clear guidance, and at the same time, they may expect a similar level of independence from you. They may feel most comfortable when you don't rely on them too heavily. When you have your own life, your own emotional stability, your own sense of self that doesn't depend on the relationship. In their mind, that's what makes the relationship healthy. Two independent people choosing to spend time together, but not needing each other in a deep emotional way. And again, this isn't inherently wrong, it's just a specific way of relating. The challenge comes when that way of relating doesn't match what you need. Because while they may feel comfortable with limited emotional expression, consistent space and low-pressure interaction, you may feel disconnected. You may want more depth, more openness, more shared emotional experience. And without that, the relationship can start to feel unfulfilling, even if everything looks fine on the surface. This is where many people get stuck, because there's no clear problem to point to. There's no obvious conflict or major issue, just a persistent feeling that something is missing. And that feeling can be difficult to address, especially when the other person believes everything is working. That's why the turning point in this dynamic isn't about changing them, it's about awareness. understanding how their version of healthy shows up in real behavior. Recognizing the patterns, seeing the limits as well as the strengths. Because there are strengths in this approach: stability, independence, low drama. But there are also limitations: reduced emotional depth, difficulty with vulnerability, challenges in communication during conflict. And once you see both sides clearly, you can start to make a more grounded decision. Not based on potential, not based on what you hope it could become, but based on what it actually is, because a relationship isn't just about whether it works in theory. It's about whether it works for you, whether it meets your emotional needs, whether it allows you to feel connected, understood, and supported. And if those needs don't align with the way the other person naturally operates, no amount of understanding will fully close that gap. It can help you make sense of it, it can reduce confusion, but it won't change the fundamental dynamic unless both people are willing to adapt. And that's the reality that often gets overlooked. It's not about one person being right and the other being wrong. It's about compatibility, about whether two different definitions of healthy can meet in a way that feels fulfilling for both people. And if they can't, then the most important shift isn't in how you try to make it work. It's in how you choose what works for you, because once you see the dynamic clearly, you're no longer trying to fix it. You're deciding whether it fits, and that decision changes everything.